It's often said that the United States is the leader of the free world, but if you scratch beneath the surface of this claim, the picture gets a little more complicated. Israel, a small country in the Middle East, has played a far more significant role in shaping the direction of Western policies, particularly in the US, than most realize. The ability of Israel to influence US policy is nothing short of remarkable, and it didn't happen by accident. For those who view this influence with skepticism, it can seem like an exaggeration or even conspiracy theory territory. But when you take a step back and look at the historical trajectory through the lens of diplomacy, power dynamics, and the unacknowledged players behind the scenes, it becomes clear that Israel, not the US, often pulls the strings. The way this influence developed is a complex tale of strategic alliances, persistent lobbying, and international diplomacy. And the beginning of that story starts much earlier than you might think. Before we can understand how Israel's influence grew so large, we have to recognize the pivotal moment in history that set everything in motion: the rise of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. By 1939, Adolf Hitler's aggressive expansionism had turned Europe into a war zone, but it was his systematic extermination of 6 million Jews during World War II that set the stage for the post-war global order. Hitler's genocidal actions left the world reeling, and the sheer scale of human suffering forced a moral reckoning on the international community. Jews, once scattered across Europe, were now refugees fleeing the ashes of the Holocaust, and the international community had to confront the reality that the Jewish people needed a homeland, a safe haven from the atrocities they had suffered. In the years following the end of World War II, Western powers began to feel the weight of this moral responsibility. The idea of a Jewish homeland had been floating around for years, but the trauma of the Holocaust made it an urgent and undeniable cause. Sympathy for Jews, particularly in the US, was growing, creating a perfect storm of support for the Zionist movement. Now, let's talk about the second domino in this chain of events: the Zionist movement, led by influential figures like Chaim Weizmann, who made the case for a Jewish state in Palestine. Weizmann, a chemist by training, had been a key figure in the movement for decades. He was the one who understood that Zionism wasn't just about the idea of a homeland. It was about leveraging the international political system to make that dream a reality. Weizmann and his colleagues were extremely adept at lobbying Western powers, and they recognized that the US was the key to gaining international recognition for the Jewish state. But they didn't just rely on diplomatic channels. They understood that money and influence were equally important. In the United States, the American Jewish community was wealthy, politically connected, and increasingly sympathetic to the Zionist cause. These individuals didn't just send financial support to the Jewish National Fund. They were actively involved in lobbying US politicians to take a strong stance on the creation of Israel. The role of wealthy Jewish American donors can't be overstated. These were individuals who could contribute substantial sums of money to political campaigns, ensuring that pro-Israel politicians were well funded and that their voices were heard. But they didn't just play the game on the national level. They had strong local and state-level networks that worked to build a coalition of support. This wasn't just about sending a check and hoping for the best. This was about building relationships, crafting narratives, and ensuring that US policy would align with their goals. One of the most important figures in this effort was David Niles, a political advisor to President Harry S. Truman. Niles played a behind-the-scenes role in steering US foreign policy toward a pro-Israel stance. He was a conduit between the White House and the Zionist leaders, ensuring that their concerns were heard and that their strategy was reflected in US policy. But it wasn't just about diplomacy and money, it was about timing. The events of the 1940s, the rise of the Cold War, and the global realignment in the wake of World War II provided the perfect political environment for the Zionists to push their cause. Which brings us to the third and most significant domino: US President Harry S. Truman. Truman wasn't the first domino to fall, but he was the most pivotal. His decision to recognize the State of Israel 1948 set the course for US-Israel relations for the next several decades. The history of Truman's decision is fascinating, and it's not as straightforward as you might think. Truman wasn't initially enthusiastic about the idea of a Jewish state. Like many politicians at the time, he had concerns about the implications of such a move, particularly with regard to America's relationship with the Arab world. However, Truman's personal connections, especially with his Jewish friend Eddie Jacobson, played a critical role in changing his mind. Jacobson, who had long been a friend and confidant of Truman, helped facilitate a meeting between the president and Chaim Weizmann. It was Jacobson who used his relationship with Truman to push the president into a meeting with the Zionist leader, arguing that Israel was a moral and strategic necessity. Truman's final decision wasn't just about moral duty. It was also politically motivated. The Jewish American vote was becoming an increasingly important factor in US elections, and Truman knew that supporting the creation of Israel could solidify his political base. In a tight election year, he made the politically savvy decision to back Israel. On May 14, 1948, Truman became the first major world leader to officially recognize the State of Israel just minutes after David Ben-Gurion declared its independence. This moment, arguably, marked the beginning of Israel's rise as a major player on the global stage. But it also marked the beginning of Israel's ability to influence US domestic politics and foreign policy.
The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority of the new State of Israel.
The impact of Truman's recognition wasn't just limited to the diplomatic world, it reverberated across US politics. From that point forward, pro-Israel PACs began to play an increasingly important role in shaping American elections. These organizations, like AIPAC, American Israel Public Affairs Committee, began to grow in influence, funneling millions of dollars into political campaigns. The money was the real power. In the years following Truman's recognition of Israel, pro-Israel donors began pouring money into the campaigns of key US politicians. These were individuals who were sympathetic to Israel's cause and who would support Israeli policies in exchange for political contributions. In a system where money is often the deciding factor in elections, Israel's lobbying machine began to shape US foreign policy in ways that were advantageous to Israel, ensuring that successive US administrations would back Israel's interests. This wasn't a case of direct control or manipulation, it was about shaping the narrative, building a coalition, and ensuring that political leaders in the US were always aligned with Israeli interests. Over time, the influence of these PACs grew, cementing Israel's status as one of the most powerful players in US politics. So, where does all this leave us today? While the United States may still be officially considered the leader of the free world, Israel's influence over American politics, military strategy, and international relations has made it the real power behind the scenes. Israel's impact on US policy isn't just about foreign aid or military support. It's about the subtle, behind-the-scenes influence that shapes the way the West responds to global crises, how foreign policy is crafted, and how international relations are navigated. Through a carefully cultivated web of diplomatic, political, and financial influence, Israel has become a force that cannot be ignored. Its control over key decision-makers in Washington and its ability to shape the policies of Western nations has made Israel a global leader, one whose influence often outweighs that of the US itself. Israel isn't just a country, it's an ideologically driven entity that has masterfully utilized the instruments of power, from money to lobbying to strategic alliances, to become the quiet force that shapes the direction of the West. And in many ways, it is Israel that holds the reins. In the end, Israel's rise to power didn't happen overnight. It wasn't about one event or one leader. It was the result of a series of well-timed, strategically executed moves that involved money, influence, and political savvy. From the rise of Hitler and the moral shift in the post-Holocaust world, to the lobbying efforts of Zionist leaders, to the crucial role of Truman and American donors, Israel's influence was carefully cultivated. And today, Israel holds a level of influence that is unparalleled, shaping the global order in ways that most people don't fully appreciate. Israel's ability to bend the West to its will is a testament to the power of influence, strategy, and the long game. In a world where power often hides in plain sight, Israel has emerged as the real leader of the free world, whether the West acknowledges it or not.